The eruption of Mount Vesuvius, the city that forgot it was sitting on a bomb. Let's go back to Pompeii, because the full story is so much more terrifying than the version you probably learned in school. August 24th, 79 AD. The city of Pompeii, population 20,000, it's a wealthy trading hub. Beautiful villas, bathhouses, restaurants, a full amphitheater. These weren't primitive people huddled in mud huts. They were sophisticated, educated Romans living in one of the most advanced civilizations on Earth at the time. And here's the detail that makes this whole story unbearable. They had warning. Minor earthquakes were reported in the 4 days before the eruption, but the warnings were not recognized. The inhabitants had been accustomed to minor tremors in the region. As Pliny the Younger wrote, they were not particularly alarming because they are frequent in Campania. Tremors were normal, so nobody left. Then at approximately 1 p.m. on August 24th, the mountain exploded. Vesuvius violently ejected a cloud of superheated tephra in gases to a height of 33 kilometers, ejecting molten rock, pulverized pumice, and hot ash at 1.5 million tons per second, ultimately releasing 100,000 times the thermal energy of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 100,000 times Hiroshima. Let that number sit with you for a moment. For the first 12 hours, Pompeii's residents faced a deadly choice: flee through falling pumice stones the size of fists, or shelter indoors, where accumulating ash threatened to collapse roofs. Archaeological evidence shows approximately 80% of Pompeii's residents escaped during those first crucial hours when evacuation was still possible. 80% got out. That's actually more than most people assume. But the ones who stayed, who thought they could wait it out, who were too old to flee, who went back home to grab their valuables, they had no idea what was coming next. Around 6:30 a.m. on August 25th, the volcanic eruption entered its deadliest phase. The column collapsed, sending the first of 6 pyroclastic surges racing down the slopes, avalanches of superheated gas, ash, and rock fragments moving at hurricane speeds. The 4th pyroclastic surge came around 7:30 a.m. and crashed into Pompeii over 200 miles per hour, with temperatures exceeding 300 degrees Celsius. It was certain death in a fraction of a second for every living thing that resided in Pompeii at that time. Certain death. In a fraction of a second. Not drowning, not burning slowly. Instantaneous death from a wave of superheated gas moving at 200 miles per hour. And here's the detail that turns this from a tragedy to something deeply haunting. When archaeologists excavated Pompeii in the 1800s, they found voids in the ash, hollow spaces, and exactly human shapes. They injected those voids with plaster, and what emerged were perfect casts of people in their final moments. A man covering his face, a woman clutching her child. Pompeii was buried under 14 to 17 feet of ash and pumice. The cities were never rebuilt and largely forgotten in the course of history. In the 18th century, they were rediscovered, providing an unprecedented archaeological record of the everyday life of an ancient civilization, startlingly preserved in sudden death. A city frozen mid-sentence, a civilization's last breath, preserved in ash for 2,000 years, waiting for us to find it and understand what we lost, one disaster down. And we haven't even gotten to the one where a single politician's decision directly caused the collapse of an empire. That one is still coming. Chernobyl, the accident that was hiding in plain sight. April 25th, 1986, a Friday night at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Soviet Ukraine. The engineers on duty were running a routine safety test. So routine, in fact, that the plant's director didn't even bother showing up. This was not considered a significant event. Just another late-night procedure. Just another checkbox. What happened next took 12 seconds. The disaster occurred while running a test to simulate cooling the reactor during an accident in blackout conditions. The operators carried out the test despite an accidental drop in reactor power, and due to a design issue, attempting to shut down the reactor in those conditions resulted in a dramatic power surge. At 1:23 a.m. on Saturday, April 26, 1986, two explosions destroyed the core of Unit 4 and the roof of the reactor building. The explosion sent fuel, core components, and structural items, and produced a shower of hot and highly radioactive debris into the air and exposed the destroyed core to the atmosphere. The plume rose up to about 1 kilometer into the air, 1 kilometer of radioactive smoke rising into the night sky above a sleeping city. And here's where the story goes from disaster to something even worse, a cover-up. After telling residents nothing about the disaster for some 36 hours, Soviet officials finally began evacuating roughly 115,000 people from Pripyat, as well as nearby towns and villages. Residents were informed it would be temporary and that they should pack only vital documents and some food. 36 hours. A city of 50,000 people walked around, went to work, sent their kids to school, breathed the air for 36 hours, while a destroyed nuclear reactor burned beside them, and their government said nothing. No reports were released until the third day after the explosion. Swedish authorities correlated a map of enhanced radiation levels in Europe with wind direction and announced to the world that a nuclear accident had occurred somewhere in the Soviet Union. Sweden found out before the Ukrainian people were told. The physical scale of what was released is almost incomprehensible. Between 50 and 185 million curies of radionuclides escaped into the atmosphere, several times more radioactivity than that created by the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This radioactivity was spread by the wind over Belarus, Russia, and Ukraine, and soon reached as far west as France and Italy, from a power plant in Ukraine. Of 600 workers present during the early morning, 134 received high doses and suffered from radiation sickness. Of these, 28 died in the first 3 months. But the long-term story is far darker. 350,000 people were eventually evacuated as a result of the accident. Thousands developed thyroid cancer. The contaminated exclusion zone, 2,600 square kilometers, remains largely uninhabitable to this day. And then there's this. In 2006, Gorbachev wrote that the Chernobyl disaster, even more than my launch of perestroika, was perhaps the real cause of the collapse of the Soviet Union. One reactor, one failed test, one government that chose secrecy over safety, and it helped bring down a superpower. Hiroshima, 8:15 in the morning, August 6th, 1945. The children of Hiroshima were at school. Mothers were cooking breakfast. Soldiers reported for morning duty. Businessmen walked to work. It was a Monday morning, completely ordinary. Then the sky turned white. 600 meters over the city, with a blinding flash, the atomic bomb exploded, creating a fireball that blazed like a small sun, more than 1 million degrees Celsius at its center. In 1 second, the fireball reached a radius of over 200 meters, and the surface temperatures near the hypocenter rose to 3,000 to 4,000 degrees Celsius. As many as 70,000 people were killed instantly. Those who survived the initial blast were hit with a powerful shock wave that leveled nearly every structure within a mile of the impact. 70,000 instantly, before a single person had time to understand what was happening. Out of a population of 343,000, some 70,000 people were killed instantly, and by the end of the year, the death toll had surpassed 100,000. 2/3 of the city area was destroyed. Nuclear shadows were all that remained of people who had been subjected to the intense thermal radiation. Nuclear shadows. That phrase, let me explain what that means. Some people standing within a certain distance of the blast were vaporized so completely and so instantly that the only evidence they had existed at all was the shadow they left on the wall or the ground behind them, a permanent silhouette burned into concrete, where a person used to be. And it didn't stop there. Radiation damage from the bomb varied considerably with distance from the hypocenter. The initial radiation emitted within a minute of the explosion was lethal within 1 kilometer. Most in that area died within a few days. Many who appeared uninjured developed disorders and died days or months later. 5 to 6 years after the bombings, the incidence of leukemia increased noticeably among survivors. After about a decade, survivors began suffering from thyroid, breast, lung, and other cancers at higher than normal rates. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, killing 60,000 to 80,000 people. 2 cities, 2 bombs, a combined death toll that historians still can't fully calculate, because radiation doesn't stop killing when the headlines move on. The pilot of the Enola Gay, Paul Tibbets, described looking back at the city after dropping the bomb. His co-pilot was pounding his shoulder saying, "Look at that, look at that, look at that," while below them, where a city of 300,000 had been standing, there was nothing but fire, smoke, and a mushroom cloud climbing 40,000 feet into the sky. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, the morning that stole 250,000 lives, December 26, 2004, the day after Christmas. Beaches across Southeast Asia were packed with tourists on holiday and local families enjoying a Sunday morning. At 7:58 a.m. local time, 160 miles off the coast of Sumatra, Indonesia, the ocean floor moved. A catastrophic magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck undersea off the west coast of Sumatra. The quake created a massive tsunami that killed approximately 230,000 people and displaced nearly 2 million people in 14 South Asian and East African countries. Traveling as fast as 500 miles per hour, the tsunami reached land in as little as 15 to 20 minutes after the quake hit, giving residents little time to flee. 500 miles per hour. That is the speed of a commercial aircraft. The tsunami was traveling at aircraft speed toward beaches full of sleeping tourists and fishing villages, with no warning systems and no time to run. In some places, especially the hardest hit Indonesia, the tsunami wave reached over 100 feet high. 100 feet, that is a 10-story building. A wall of water the height of a 10-story building, moving at 500 miles per hour, hitting a beach with nowhere to go. And here is the detail that makes this story uniquely heartbreaking. In some areas, the ocean pulled back first. The water retreated dramatically from the shore, exposing the seabed, revealing fish flopping on the sand. Coral reefs suddenly visible, a strange and beautiful sight. People walked out onto the exposed seafloor to look at the fish. They were walking into the killing zone, and most of them had no idea why the water was retreating, because they'd never been taught what that means. It means the tsunami is coming. The Indian Ocean tsunami is the deadliest tsunami on record and prompted a global humanitarian response. 14 countries, 2 million displaced, 230,000 dead. An event so enormous that it literally shifted the rotation of the Earth's axis by a fraction of a degree. The world spent the next decade building warning systems for events like this across the Indian Ocean. Before December 26, 2004, there were none. The 1931 China floods, the deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history that nobody talks about. Here is a question for you. What is the deadliest natural disaster in recorded human history? You probably said the 2004 tsunami, or maybe an earthquake, or maybe you thought it Hiroshima. All wrong. It's a flood in China in 1931, and most people in the Western world have never heard of it. The major flood of 1931 stands out above all. It covered tens of thousands of square miles, flooding rice fields in various cities, including Nanjing and Wuhan. The flood affected more than 50 million people. Government organizations estimated the death toll at about 3.7 million people. 3.7 million people, not in a war, not from a bomb, from water. To put that in context, the entire population of Los Angeles is about 4 million people. This flood killed nearly that many human beings from a single event, in a single year. Part of what made the flood so deadly is that it happened during a period of extreme political instability and conflict. The flood destroyed crops. No crops meant no food. No food meant famine. Famine meant disease. Disease spread through 52 million displaced, homeless, starving people. The water killed them first, then the hunger, then the cholera. This is the deadliest natural disaster in human history, and it happened less than 100 years ago, and most people have never heard its name. The Tangshan earthquake, the city that was erased in 23 seconds, July 28, 1976, 3:42 in the morning. The city of Tangshan, China. Population, 1 million people, almost all of them asleep. A magnitude 7.8 earthquake struck at 3:42 a.m. Tangshan, an industrial city with a population of about 1 million at the time of the disaster, suffered staggering casualties of over 240,000. While this was the official death toll, some experts suggest the loss of life was likely closer to 700,000. Reportedly, 85% of Tangshan's buildings collapsed, and trembles were felt in Beijing, more than 100 miles away. 85% of all buildings gone in 23 seconds. The earthquake lasted 23 seconds. In 23 seconds, a city of 1 million people was essentially erased. The official death toll is 240,000. There was no warning, no minor tremors, no gradual buildup, no government alert. At 3:42 a.m., Tangshan was a functioning city. At 3:43 a.m., it was rubble. The people who survived described waking up not to an earthquake, but to already being buried, already trapped under collapsed concrete, already in darkness. Tangshan was rebuilt. It's a functioning city today, but somewhere beneath modern Tangshan, deep in the foundations of a city that rebuilt itself on top of its own catastrophe, 700,000 people are still there. All right, I owe you an answer. Which disaster involved a politician whose single decision directly caused the collapse of an empire? Chernobyl. And the politician was Mikhail Gorbachev, but not in the way you might think. See, the standard story says Chernobyl was just a nuclear accident that embarrassed the Soviet Union. But the real story is more specific than that, and more devastating. When the reactor exploded, the Soviet government's response was to lie, to cover it up, to tell their own people the situation was under control, to refuse foreign medical aid, to parade their citizens through contaminated streets on May Day while the reactor burned. The world saw all of it in real time, and what happened next wasn't just political damage. It remains the worst nuclear disaster and the most expensive disaster in history, with an estimated cost of $700 billion. The Soviet Union spent money it didn't have, containing a disaster it had tried to pretend didn't exist. It destroyed public trust in the government at every level. One reactor, one failed safety test, one government that lied. The Soviet Union collapsed 5 years later. A nuclear accident didn't just kill people. It killed an empire. I promised you something special at the end, something most people don't know. Here it is. Mount Vesuvius is still active. It last erupted in 1944. And right now, today, 3 million people live near enough to be affected by an eruption, with at least 600,000 in the immediate danger zone. 600,000 people live in the confirmed kill zone of an active volcano that has erupted within living memory. And here's what volcanologists say about the next eruption. Not if it happens, but when. They describe the likely next event as a sub-Plinian eruption, smaller than 79 AD, but still catastrophically dangerous for a modern, densely populated area. The Italian government has evacuation plans. They run drills. They have warning systems. But the evacuation plan for 600,000 people in a region of Italy with narrow roads, heavy traffic, and dense urban infrastructure, currently estimated completion time of about 72 hours. The 79 AD eruption gave Pompeii approximately 18 hours before the pyroclastic surges arrived. The most terrifying thing about history's worst disasters isn't that they happened in the past. It's that the conditions that caused most of them, arrogance, unpreparedness, the assumption that everything is stable and permanent, those conditions are still very much with us. Subscribe to the Wild Decode, because the next great disaster isn't a history lesson. It's a countdown.